am midway through my current read and enjoying every minute of it. Admittedly, it's sort of strange to be taking a step backwards and looking at a book I finished at the end of July, but sometimes the wind takes you that way, and as it's currently absolutely chucking it down here, the title of the book feels somewhat appropriate. As I mentioned in the last episode, my reading got a little bit of a rough start, and to be honest, the rest of the month hasn't shown much of an improvement, but I have read some great books in that time, so all is not exactly lost, just a tad slower than I anticipated it being. Anyway, here I am, no spoilers, as opinion-filled as ever, and ready to roll. All of which means it's time for the latest episode of Being Bookish. This week I am headed to a small town somewhere in the UK called Walmsley Heath, probably completely made up. It's sometime after the end of the Second World War, and there are a few bizarre things happening. Though the story may not sound like it, I am going to be following in the footsteps of a great Belgian private detective with Agatha Christie's 1948 mystery novel, Taken at the Flood. I'm your host Ray, self-confessed bookworm, introvert, hermit, and long-term depression sufferer. Join me on my journey through my ever-growing to-be-read pile and enjoy the latest of my 100% spoiler-free book reviews. This book is one I purchased because it was actually the July selection for the 2024 Agatha Christie read-along. Have I mentioned that I'm doing that this year enough times yet for you to get sick of hearing it? Or should I perhaps mention it a few more? I know you are probably fed up with hearing me say 2024 Agatha Christie read-along, but I am really enjoying it. It's introduced me to a few of her lesser-known works and encouraged me to reread others that I haven't picked up in quite a few years. The war is over, but the mystery has just begun. A few weeks after marrying an attractive young widow, Gordon Clode is tragically killed by a bomb blast in the London Blitz. Overnight, the former Mrs. Underhay finds herself in sole possession of the Clode family fortune. Shortly afterwards, Hercule Poirot receives a visit from the dead man's sister-in-law, who claims she has been warned by spirits that Mrs. Underhay's first husband is still alive. Poirot, understandably, has his suspicions when he is asked to find a missing person guided only by the spirit world. Yet what mystifies Poirot most is the woman's true motive for approaching him. The little grey cells hold the solution. The book starts with a prologue that explains everything, the cause of all of the events that take place throughout the book. It's 1944 and Major Porter, a World War I veteran, is trapped in a darkened club as overhead London is being bombed. He tells the story of an unfortunate death that occurred just a few weeks earlier, that of Gordon Clode, a wealthy older English gentleman who had only recently returned to the country with a young bride, the widow Rosaline Underhay. Major Porter talks about the mysterious disappearance of her first husband, Robert, and how many presumed that he could still be alive, but remains dead because his marriage was not the happiest. He then mentions that the young Mrs. Clode is now incredibly wealthy, the only fortunate survivor of the bombing, which killed her husband and several others in the house. Of course, Hercule Poirot was among the other unfortunates who were trapped with Major Porter as he told this tale. 2 years later, in 1946, Poirot is forced to recall this rather unpleasant situation when Mrs. Kathleen Clode arrives at his offices, wanting to hire him to investigate Mr. Underhay's disappearance, as a spirit guide told her that the man still lives. Poirot, stating his religious beliefs, declines the case. Life goes on, yet for the people in Walmsley Heath it becomes far more complicated and much harder. Lynn Marchmont and her mother, Gordon's younger sister, relied on Gordon's goodwill to live, but now he is dead and his young wife has the money. They are struggling, their house is in disrepair, bills go unpaid, and Mrs. Marchmont is on the verge of losing her home. Lynn was a member of the Wrens and has only just returned home, but with no job and finding it hard to find work, she is of no help to her mother or anyone else. We are then introduced to Frances Clode, wife to one of Gordon's younger brothers. Her husband is a solicitor, so it's not unfair to assume he is managing his money and they are living well. Unfortunately for Frances, her husband has a gambling problem, and the house is now at risk of repossession. Then there's Rowley, another nephew, a man encouraged by his Uncle Gordon to take up farming, because he will always be there to support him should the need arise. All of these people relied on Gordon and his money and were sure that, should the worst happen, they would be taken care of. But they didn't account for him ever taking a young wife and leaving everything to her, or that she would be protected from their financial demands by an older brother, David. David takes great pleasure in watching the Clodes squirm as they ask for something they always assumed would be theirs. He likes to see them begging and then enjoys saying no, but he doesn't account for the attraction he feels the first time he meets Lynn Marchmont, who has been engaged to Rowley for more than 6 years. A rather unkind character, David is self-satisfied and almost cruel, demanding that the family pay back any monies they may have managed to convince his sister to give them, for it is hers and no one else's. It's quite clear by this time that the whole family is sitting on a very volatile powder keg, and just one more thing would cause it to explode. The Clode siblings and the younger generation are frustrated that their future well-being has been affected because Gordon's young wife survived what Gordon was unable to. Young Rosaline is terrified, paranoid, and wants nothing more than to leave England with her husband's money and head to America. But David is having far too much fun playing his manipulative games with the family, as though he has something against them personally, but this is never made completely clear. He is also enjoying wooing a rather reluctant Lynn, trying to persuade her that she would be better with him than the man she has remained loyal to. Of course, good things must almost always come to an end, and things start to fall apart for David just a little when a strange man arrives in town and asks after Rosaline. Is he her erstwhile missing husband, Robert Underhay, or simply, as a suspicious letter sent to David intimates, someone who knows the truth about what happened to Mr. Underhay in Nigeria? When the man's body is discovered in his room at the local inn, the Stag, it sets in motion a series of events that leads to 2 more unfortunate deaths. But would one of them have had to happen anyway? Given everything he and his sister have to lose should the truth about the stranger be discovered, David is considered the prime suspect, and it is at the inquiry that the case again garners Poirot's attention, and he finally decides to investigate. He has an in, of course, because Kathleen Clode has already asked him to look into this, but so much has happened since that point. He wants to know what is going on behind the scenes in Walmsley Heath. Should he perhaps have taken the case when Kathleen Clode reached out to him, or was he right to turn it down? Of course, where Poirot goes, a solution is sure to follow, but will we get a happily ever after, or will everyone wish they hadn't poked the hornet's nest? So much can be said about Agatha Christie, and if you are a fan of the cosy mystery, then no doubt you'll have read at least 2. Most people will go directly to the ones they're familiar with, Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, while others will select something a little bit more obscure, and to me, that's what this novel, Taken at the Flood, was. And having now read it, I think I can see why that may be the case. Bonnie felt that this was one of the weakest Poirot novels she's read and gave it 1 star. She said, "This is one of the weakest Poirot books in all of Christie's bibliography. This is one of her worst works, period. The plot hinges on a rich family member not writing out a will properly, getting married and then throwing the family who were made to depend on him in a massive tizzy when he gets married, and all the money goes to the new young wife. This could all have been prevented if the man had written out his will or set up an allowance for his different family members. Most, if not all, characters are totally unlikable by the end. A solid chunk of them added nothing but padding to the plot. This book comes across as misogynistic. A lot of women are described as going through a lot of trauma, or at least being a bit weird or odd. Poirot doesn't really do much in the novel. There are far too many coincidences and lucky breaks that fall in his favour that he does not get to really exercise his famous little grey cells. Usually you can follow along with his logic and how he reveals the clues that lead to the solution. In this book, nope. Poirot does not feel like Poirot in this book. He walks in on an attempted murder, reveals who did what and when, and then just leaves. He saw a woman being attacked, and this is a man who loves and respects women, and is like, yeah, that's fine. The ending is horrid. Other reviewers have pointed it out, and I will be adding to the pile. Unsurprisingly, a considerable number of the reviewers who felt the book deserved a lower rating had the same feelings regarding the characterisation of women, the absence of Poirot in a Poirot novel, and the epilogue. Of course, I am not going to dig into that in depth because it's related to a huge spoiler, and even if this wasn't one of her best novels, it would be incredibly unfair of me to unveil the killer. As I always say when it comes to reviews though, opinions are incredibly personal. So what one loves another may not, and vice versa. I am going to get into my personal opinion of the book a little bit later, but I do like to try and keep things balanced, so I look to other people's views to help me do that. On Goodreads, the overall rating for the book is 3.75, which is a little closer to the lower end of the rating scale for Christie, and on Storygraph it's 3.47. I think that the facility to give half and quarter star ratings on Storygraph may well give a more accurate view of what the readers think of the book. At least that's my personal view. Though I am a huge fan of Christie's works, especially her Poirot novels, this is one that I had not encountered before. However, it still garnered a rather generous number of ratings and reviews, especially in comparison with some newer books I have read recently, including The Kingdom is a Golden Cage, which I reviewed a couple of weeks ago. Taken at the Flood has 26,085 ratings and 2,147 reviews over on Goodreads. Out of that pool of 26,085, 61% or 16,048 readers gave it a positive 4 or 5 star rating, while 6% or 2,030 reviewers gave it just 1 or 2 stars. Jonathan gave the book 5 stars, though he does highlight that there are certain areas that would be frowned upon incredibly were it written today. He said, "Wow. Agatha Christie is in true form with this book. She tells a compelling and interesting story, telling it in the most unique of ways. In fact, you might describe this book as a reverse mystery. This is certainly a book that I want to go and reread because there is so much laid in early on that I'd love to pick up on. Christie is very economical, and in this book in particular, she does not waste any scenes. Almost every single encounter is vital to uncovering the mystery. Perhaps the best part of the book is the fear that Christie creates. You fear for so many characters here, and you actually pity all of them, except one. Christie gives each character something to make you root for them, and then gives you something to make you worried the character is a murderer. The reveal sequence is actually so bizarre and ridiculous that I actually laughed out loud while reading it. It makes total sense, but the way Christie was able to make it plausible in the story is just incredible. Although I must admit, if a modern woman author wrote women the way Agatha Christie does in this book, boy would they get a lot of trouble. Overall, I loved this book. I was fearful that I had read too many good Christie books that I would not be impressed by anymore, and this book was just brilliant. 9 out of 10. I've said it before, and I'll no doubt repeat it many times, but a good cozy mystery remains my chosen comfort read. I'm still looking for the author who can play Christie at her own game, though I have yet to find them, so the search does continue. That said, there is no one who can do it quite like Christie. She is the queen of crime for a very good reason. Her characters are usually well crafted, even if sometimes they aren't well used, and the mysteries are clever, though some could, admittedly, be a little better. Anyway, now I've told you about other people's views, let's get down to it. Here are my thoughts on Taken by the Flood by Agatha Christie. Completely spoiler-free and 100% honest. Did I like the book? This is 26th Hercule Poirot mystery, and before I picked it up, I did no research. I didn't bother to watch the 2006 ITV adaptation that I actually didn't know existed, with David Suchet, Jenny Agutter and Celia Imrie, though I know I will be watching at a later date, or have any ideas as what to expect. The title is actually a quote from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. I can see how this may well relate to the plot of the book and the characters within, though it's never really clear if the book itself took inspiration from the quote. However, there is a fortune waiting for many of the characters, and they just need to fling their morals in a basket and forget about them in order to get it. I have to be honest, like Jonathan, I started off the book feeling a tiny bit of pity, especially for Lynn and Adela Marchmont. Unlike Gordon's brothers and nephews, who can much easier make their own way in the world, a woman in the 1940s found things a lot tougher. Women were expected to become wives and mothers, but when their husbands passed, it was anticipated that their married daughters and working sons would care for them when their late father's estate couldn't. Adela doesn't have this. She has relied upon her older brother and his fortune, and depended upon it supporting her until she died. Of course, that also depended greatly on poor Gordon Clode remaining single and alone, the sole supporter of many greedy beneficiaries for the rest of his life. So the fact that his family is not happy that he didn't die alone and miserable, though he was bombed, so we may never know, is a little unfair and shows their less favourable characteristics. Lynn, for example, is incredibly angry at the world. She knows that she has committed to certain things, such as marrying Rowley, but she is also confused when she is presented with an alternative option in David Hunter. She finds him attractive. He seems to reciprocate her feelings, yet something is holding her back, whether that is a lack of trust in her own judgment or the fact that her mother is expecting her to not only support her for the rest of her life, but also stay loyal to the family that is having massive issues with David Hunter and his sister, Rosaline Clode, or Underhay, or Hunter as was. So Lynn is stuck between a rock and a hard place. However, she isn't necessarily the most kind, understanding, gentle character that she originally comes across as, and I will get into that in a little bit because I think that there is a very pertinent scene. Yes, she does experience certain elements of trauma, and there is a scene much later on in the book that I'm not going to go into because it's a huge spoiler that makes you think, oh my god, she has to go through so much. But then comes the epilogue and you just want to slap her upside the head. So it's quite difficult to, when I started feeling massive pity for her and sympathising for her situation. And then I wanted to just go, no, this is so wrong. Adela, Lynn's mother, is incredibly wishy-washy and she is somewhat manipulative. She knows what she wants, and there are moments where you can sort of sense that she is sympathetic and kindly, and then she will, because she needs something, because she's so used to having it, ignoring her daughter's advice and ignoring what everybody else has been telling her, she goes to Rosaline and in some mean way manipulates the young, desperately sad woman into writing her a cheque for £500, which these days, I mean, it doesn't sound like a massive amount of money by today's standards. I mean, it's not exactly a small amount of money by today's standards, but it's not massive. But in the 1940s, it would have been considered a small fortune. Not only would it have paid off her debts, but it also pays off her bills and everything else. So she is manipulative in that respect. Aunt Katie, Kathleen Clode, is clearly easily led. She is coerced into believing what the spirits say. And though that could potentially be seen again as a rather manipulative and greedy method of getting her own way, she tries to use it on the wrong audience when she speaks with Poirot, who states when she tells him she's been guided by the spirits, he tells her that he is a Catholic and believes in God, and therefore this spiritual journey that she is on and this spiritual information she has received is not something that he feels comfortable with trusting, which I think is another reason why he turned her away when she came to seek help. Frances Clode, the wife of the other younger Clode brother, is very, very clever, but again, manipulative. She is quite cruel and entitled, and I think this comes a lot from her upbringing. Her father was a wealthy, titled landowner who got into incredible debt, and she married her father's older solicitor, Lionel Clode, in order to, well, she claims that she loved him, she loves him, and she does stand by him, but there is an element of entitlement to her, and she's not above sinking to a low level in order to get what she wants and what she feels she is owed. When her husband tells her that he has gambled away all this money, he's embezzled from the company he is a partner in, and he's also mortgaged the house, so there is nothing left for them, she's the one who comes up with a solution, but it's not necessarily the best one. And I feel that these four women are a very poor example of women in Agatha Christie novels, because, I mean, we know how much she loves women. Look at the way she writes Miss Marple and the way she writes Tuppence, though Tuppence I do find a quite irritating character. Next, we have Rosaline Clode, who is the young widowed wife of the man who caused all the problems, Gordon Clode. He didn't cause them on purpose, he just should have written a better will. She is confused, she is easily manipulated, she is weak, she is clearly terrified of her brother David, and therefore very easily manipulated into believing that all of these people who are asking her for money and expecting something from Gordon's estate are out to kill her, and they will kill her to get what they want. And that is her brother telling her this. Her brother, who is cruel, greedy, vindictive. He seems to take incredible joy in finding the worst characteristics in every single person he meets. And I can't help thinking this is because he knows he is that cruel himself. So he is only seeing them as a mirror of himself. He is hungry for the position that his sister's marriage has managed to achieve for him, and he enjoys the power he has over these people who would previously potentially have looked down upon him because he didn't have as much as they did. Of course, the tides do tend to turn in these situations, and they definitely do for David, and I don't think it's necessarily undeserving that he gets his comeuppance. I'm kind of disappointed that it occurs the way it does, but he does deserve to get some comeuppance. Then we have Roly Clode, who is blinded by his own needs and wants. Lynn has finally returned to the family fold after being in the Wrens during the war. She took her time to come back after the war, and now she's there. She is his for the taking, because as far as he's concerned, she belongs to him because they made a promise before the war began. And he is also resentful because he was persuaded by Gordon to start to work the farmland with a friend. This friend then, because during the war, if you worked the farmland, one of you, if you were men, could stay behind and continue working the farmland because produce was needed. So he continued working the farmland while his friend went to war. His friend sadly was killed in action, and he's left behind thinking, oh well, it's okay, if the worst happens, my uncle will bail me out, he'll help me financially. And then his uncle dies, and his uncle's wife takes everything, and he's left with a struggling farm and doesn't know what to do. So he is massively resentful. And then, of course, we have the man of the hour, the person for whom the book is really, it's in his series, and that's Poirot. For all that this is a Poirot novel, he is not really shown in his best light. In fact, he doesn't appear in the book. He appears at the beginning of the book. He's in the prologue. He's in the prologue, and then he appears probably towards the last quarter of the book, but he isn't really the active, impassioned, knowledgeable character that we are so used to seeing. And this disappointed me. I liked the fact that we got to know all the characters without Poirot gesticulating or making any assumptions about them. I enjoyed that aspect. Don't get me wrong. I think that this was a very clever way to get to know the characters and see the motivations behind everything that happened. However, this was a Poirot novel, and for a Poirot novel, I expect him to be there, and he's not even mentioned from the prologue until the last quarter of the book. And when he is mentioned, it is at the inquiry into what happened with the mysterious man who could maybe have been Mr. Robert Underhay. It perplexed me completely. So while I love Poirot and I think that Christie is a very good writer, this book was not my favourite. I would say read it because I think that there are some very clever red herrings and twists and turns to the story. But don't read the end. Don't read the epilogue. That's all I'm saying. Don't read the epilogue, because it will make most people just throw something. What went wrong? This was, for me personally, a rather weak contribution to my Poirot collection, and it's certainly not one that I'm going to be revisiting in a hurry. Though the core of the mystery was it really was there. The elements that went into making it could be, at times, sort of distasteful. For some reason, there is a distinct lack of respect for women, which, I have to be honest here, pains me to write, because it felt as though Christie had this moment of bitterness when she was creating every single one of the female characters in the novel and made them either weak, easily led, or just genuinely cruel. There is no sisterhood here. And at times I was reminded of a court case I heard when I was a really young child back in the 80s. And a judge blamed an 8-year-old girl wearing a short skirt for the horrific assault she experienced. And I wish I were joking. I can remember it clearly to this day. The judge said, well, what were you wearing? And this 8-year-old girl had gone through horrific trauma. And the judge justified the actions of the perpetrator because the young girl was wearing a skirt. We all wore short skirts in the 80s. It was the 80s. I wish you'd tell me when you come in, Lynn. I'm always nervous when you're out alone after dark. Really, Mums, don't you think I can look after myself? Well, there have been dreadful things in the papers lately. All these discharged soldiers, they attack girls. I expect the girls ask for it. She smiled, rather a twisted smile. Yes, girls did ask for danger. Who, after all, really wanted to be safe? Now, I'm not saying that every element of the book is like that, but for some reason I can't quite put my finger on. It feels as though there were so many moments in this book where women were either being specifically targeted or they were targeting other women. Frances Claude, who discovers that her husband has gambled away everything, determines that she is therefore entitled to blackmail David Hunter and his sister in order that she doesn't lose her home. Katie tries to hire Poirot to discover that Rosaline is guilty of bigamy. Adela takes advantage of a young, terrified woman and convinces her to give her money. Rowley attacks someone, and David blackmails, bribes his sister and terrifies her to the point where she is absolutely petrified at the thought of seeing anybody. It makes her paranoid. I know it can't always be the man who is guilty of the crime, and Christie is pretty equal opportunity when it comes to creating her murderers. I just feel perhaps Christie went out of her way in this book to highlight their cruelty. Another failing for me personally was Poirot's absence. I don't necessarily want to see him on every single page, but as a novel where he is meant to be at the core, Taken at the Flood does things differently. The novel is, to be fair, a brisk one, but I personally think that something was missing. And yeah, as for that epilogue, what on earth was that all about? The mystery itself is a really well thought out one with so many red herrings you could be forgiven for losing track. However, there is one massive twist which occurs at the end of the book that had me and many of the other readers banging their heads in frustration. And I'm not surprised, to be fair. That epilogue has to be read to be believed. But don't just skip to the end, because trust me when I tell you, it really won't make any sense to you at all. If you're looking for something like this, or you loved this and want something else, then try these. There are so many incredible cozy mysteries out there on the shelf, and while this wasn't one of my favourites, I will point you in the direction of Evil Under the Sun, Hickory Dickory Dock, Appointment with Death, and Murder in Mesopotamia. These are some of my favourites, and I feel that in these you do get the best of Poirot as well as some of the best of Christie. If you're looking for something a little bit more modern, I have to suggest Robert Thorogood's Marlowe series, starting with the Marlowe Murder Club. I would also recommend taking a look at the wonderful Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers by Jesse Sutanto. There is something so enchanting about the characters in this novel that I honestly have to stop myself from picking it up instead of continuing to work my way through my rather considerable TBR. I think that I am still hovering at the tail end of my Babylonia slump, but I am slowly pulling myself out of it. And as I am currently enjoying a week off work, I am hoping to pick up a few more incredible novels and enjoy them over the coming days. September is going to be a pretty quiet month for purchases. Just one of my anticipated reads will be landing on my doorstep this month, and it just happens to be a beautiful Goldsborough special edition of Somewhere Beyond the Sea. Admittedly, I also need to reread The House in the Cerulean Sea, as it's been a while. I think I read it in 2022. But I need to purchase a new copy, and the edition I truly want to add to my collection doesn't actually come out until the 10th of September. Though, to be fair, that's not actually that far away. I am still working my way through Goldsmith, the sequel and final part of a duology by Nikki Palpretto that I started last year. It's wonderfully written and merges Norse mythology with dark fantasy. I'm enjoying the characters, and the fact that I know this closes the series is making me feel incredibly happy. There is certainly something to be said for a series that says it will be 2 books and truly is. Sometimes a series can go on for far too long, and what should be completed ends up being dragged out unnecessarily, in my view. Here I am thinking of a few specific series, and I am sure, no doubt, you could name some too. Though September is set to be a quiet month, October and November are going to be really book full, and I can't wait. But as we get closer to the end of the year, I am conscious of the books that are still sitting unread on my 24 for 24, and the books filling my 1-star Goodreads review jar. So perhaps I will need to put the new ones away to treat myself with in January, if I can wait that long. I don't think I'll be able to wait that long for Somewhere Beyond the Sea, if I'm truthful. Are you doing a 24 for 24? If so, how are you getting along with it? Or how are you getting along with your 2024 reading plans? Do you make any, or do you just fly by the seat of your pants and read whatever fills your mind or takes your eye on the bookcase? Well, that's it for this week, and thank you so much for continuing to listen as I trot out my wonderful and hopefully not massively biased reviews. If you like what you hear, why not share it with your friends and family, and please post a star rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of the other podcatchers where you might listen, because it really does help. You can also follow me on Instagram as Being Bookish Pod, on X as being_bookish. You can also find these episodes and video content on my YouTube channel, Ray Loves Reading, which can be found using the hashtag @BeingBookishPod. Or if you prefer to read everything, you can find some of my spoiler-free reviews and my reading tracker, plus all these links on my website, beingbookish.co.uk. Just in time for the next episode, I am going to be speaking with author Julie Owen Moylan about her latest novel, Circus of Mirrors. I finished it in a single sitting and it was really moving. It comes out in September. I really can't wait to talk about it. But if you're looking for something to listen to in the interim, check out my back catalogue. Or if you're looking for something horror, check out Once Upon a Nightmare, which has recently returned with some brand new episodes. In the meantime, this is me saying farewell.